All right. Welcome to today's broadcast. Welcome to the Pro-Democracy Variety Hour. It used to be an hour. Your friendly host, Davina. Thanks for tuning in. So today we're talking about Merrick Garland and the evident overly closeness of some Fox News hosts and the former president of the United States while he was in office. He had unofficial advisors, Sean Hannity, Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham, people who should have had distance from the White House considering they were reporting on it, but who were evidently unofficial personal advisors with a hotline to Donald Trump and his chief of staff. Chief of staff at the time of January the 6th was Mark Meadows, who's refused to comply with a subpoena from the January 6th Investigatory Committee, even though he has also turned over thousands of documents and thousands of text messages, providing a good basis for the committee to insist that more people step forwards on the basis of being subpoenaed or on a voluntary basis if they so choose. Who's been asked to appear voluntarily? Somebody. Sean Hannity. Sean Hannity's been asked to appear before the January 6th committee on a voluntary basis, even though it does seem from the text messages that have been revealed so far between Sean Hannity and Mark Meadows, as if Sean Hannity had a big hand in planning for Trump's various prongs of his attempts to overthrow the election results. We know of the violent prong of inciting and inviting people to attack the Capitol building in an effort to delay the certification of the election results. But do many people realize or know much about the procedural prong of that effort to overthrow the election results? Do people know that there was a memo written by high-profile constitutional lawyer John Eastman, or a PowerPoint presentation primarily authored by a former high-rank army official called, what's his name? Paul Waldron. Paul Waldron was the former general who helped co-author this PowerPoint presentation on how to overthrow the election results by claiming that Venezuela and China had overthrown the integrity of America's electronic voting machines, and that Mike Pence could be prevailed on. We also had Peter Navarro, former trade advisor to Donald Trump, who has outed himself as being one of the key players of something he called the Green Bay Sweep, an effort to overthrow the election results. Is everything okay, Bob? I see there's a comment that says frozen screen, and I hope that comment has resolved itself, but can't see any comments from Bob right now, so fingers crossed. And let's bring up on screen what I'm often sharing, which is Twitter. Here we go. Twitter, because I wanted to quote from Merrick Garland that the Department of Justice remains committed to holding all January the 6th perpetrators at any level accountable under the law, whether they were present that day or were otherwise criminally responsible for the assault on our democracy. We'll follow the facts wherever they lead. So that was a reassuring thing for Merrick Garland to say. People note that even if he's saying the right things, the statute of limitations expires in the next few weeks with regards to the evidence of obstruction that Robert Mueller documented in the Mueller report, but Robert Mueller didn't act on, owing to an Office of Legal Counsel memo from 1973, which stipulated as strongly as a memo has the authority to do, that a sitting president shouldn't be prosecuted. So Robert Mueller said he wouldn't pronounce on whether or not Trump had committed obstruction because Trump wouldn't have right of reply in a courtroom because under that memo, under the guidance of that memo, he would not be able to be charged in the first place. So couldn't make an appearance whilst he was president in court to defend himself from any accusations of obstruction. Hence, Robert Mueller didn't make that accusation out loud, although he did collate pages and pages of 12 different instances of obstruction of justice. And the obstruction of justice pertained to collusion with Russia. So a very important thing to be able to investigate thoroughly and make clear, well-informed pronouncements about. Did Donald Trump collude with Russia in order to help influence the election results of 2016? Was Donald Trump significantly and knowingly beholden to Vladimir Putin when he took office in 2017? And Robert Mueller couldn't answer those questions because, as guilty people often do, significant obstruction occurred and people were asked not to cooperate, people refused to answer questions honestly, and the process was muddied, and therefore the question wasn't answered in a way that would have bipartisan support. People closely following it, partisan people who were at least more open to the idea that Trump may have behaved treasonously, could see that, yes, there's a stack of evidence. Trump's campaign manager, Paul Manafort, meeting with a suspected Russian intelligence officer, Konstantin Kilimnik, in the Trump Hotel to exchange proprietary data from the Republican Party on voter statistics in battleground states such as Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, feeding a Russian intelligence officer voting data about the American population in states critical to the Electoral College system for the outcome of an election in which Donald Trump lost the popular vote by 3 million. So in a system where one person has one vote that counts, he would have lost, but through the Electoral College system, which is weighted more towards white voters in relatively low population states, that becomes more significant. Your ability to appeal to the brains of people who are perhaps more readily clouded by racism, and the hierarchical type of thinking that accompanies it, which is often irrational. If you think white people occupy a more superior rung on a hierarchy, then it's easier to trick you into saying immigrants don't really contribute to American society. They're more of a net drain than a net positive, and you shouldn't vote for Democrats because they'll just take your hard-earned taxes and use it to help undeserving people, including undeserving immigrants, including undeserving Black people who you still resent because you haven't emotionally resolved the guilty conscience you attach to the events of history. People on the left are often accused of wallowing in guilt over historical occurrences such as slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, voter suppression of Black people in America and war, as to say nothing of the treatment of Native Americans and the treatment of other migrant groups. No, not other migrant groups, because Native Americans are most essentially not migrants to America, but other minority groups such as Japanese migrants who were put in detention during World War II. And Democrats are now associated with wanting to help underserved groups, minority groups, and persecuted groups in order to lift everybody into a state of being that reflects their American citizenship or their American residency. And the philosophical underpinning of that isn't just that it's the morally right thing to do, but that it's the socially right thing to do, that it helps everyone when you ease, when you make voting accessible, when you make school an opportunity to lift everybody up regardless of their home life or material circumstances, and that everybody benefits from putting an enablement scaffolding structure in place. And a lot of Americans buy into that idea, actually, but then there are some overarching ways to get some rusted on ideologically based opposition to social safety nets. And that's how you get the content of a book such as Dying of Whiteness by Jonathan Metzl. I'm very proud and excited to be part of a reading group, a book club that's going to be analysing that book in the coming weeks, but we have to all read it first, 8 pages a day. I've read the introduction and I've skimmed through some different chapters, but the case of Trevor, who was a man in Tennessee with hepatitis C and liver damage, and he was dying through lack of access to modern medicine. He didn't qualify for Medicaid. He was a taxi driver. In neighboring Kentucky, the governing party had consented to accept federal funds to expand eligibility to Medicaid and Medicare. Trevor in Tennessee, neighboring Tennessee, a mere 39 miles away from the border of Kentucky, did not qualify and was living in poor conditions, was hobbling around on a Zimmer frame, even though he was only 43, dying of liver failure because he couldn't access the level of medical care that he needed. And he was interviewed and said he was glad that Tennessee hadn't accepted federal dollars to expand Medicaid because he didn't want his taxes going to help what he claimed was Mexicans and welfare queens. In other words, the antisocial programming of anti-authority Republican politicians and Republican-leaning or Republican conspiratorial media, such as Fox News, had convinced Trevor that social safety nets such as Medicare were undesirable because they involved theft of your tax money and delivery of services to people he was racially resentful of. Now, race is a social construct, but there's ways in which societies have been constructed to harm others and to harm certain groups, and for people in power to benefit from being perceived as delivering those harmful outcomes, because those harmful outcomes to undeserving people are congruent with racist convictions that have either arisen independently or are the inheritance of people who have familial legacies of hating and resenting and and desiring the political neglect of Black people and Native Americans and migrants, or a combination of those groups. All right, one thing I was very happy about Merrick Garland saying today. Oh, Bob's back. Thank you. And Christopher's there as well. Pardon me. Bob is noting that the medication for hepatitis C cost $189,000 for 80 pills, and you were able to get it for $4,000. That's fantastic, Bob. Pardon me. Christopher says, take it easy, lady. Thanks, Christopher. I will. Something else Merrick Garland said. He said, fanatical believers in the big lie are now contesting elections, often at very low levels. Jobs, local treasurer, to be local electoral counter. Basically, the Republican Party, the Trump-led Republican Party, are encouraging the infiltration of governance at a local level, the governance of electoral infrastructure at a local level. And that's because one of the big things that stopped Trump's coup was the conscience of individuals. So the conscience of Republicans, such as Republican Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, who I don't like. He supports GOP-led legislation that makes it difficult for people to vote in Georgia. They've made it illegal to hand out food and water to people in waiting lines who are queuing up to vote. Ostensibly to remove potential influence, that you could influence people, influence their voting choices by giving them water. So I gave you free water. I'm a Democrat. I've just changed your vote from Republican to Democrat out of gratitude that you feel because I'm not letting you be parched anymore in this queue. But really, it's humanitarian. If you give people food and water, they could ban political signage to do with that activity. They could say, okay, but anybody can do it, just you can't wear political affiliated slogans or symbols on your clothes or have signage that's political. And then people would still be able to receive the humanitarian assistance to allow them to endure waiting in 9-hour queues, because they would have food or water or assistance from helpful, benevolent fellow citizens and fellow residents of the United States. But Brad Raffensperger is on board with GOP legislators in Georgia who have made that act illegal, that act of giving out food and water to voters, being forced by a substandard election system of waiting in long queues purely to exercise their democratic rights. So having differential wait times across the country is an act that is repressive of the right to vote. If you allow it to be well funded in some places and well served by different polling locations that cater appropriately to the population size, then you are fairly providing access to the vote. But if you underfund election infrastructure so that some people have to queue up for hours and hours and hours to vote, not only is the inconvenience undemocratic and a deterrent to vote, but the very fact that you need to have a free potential 10 hours so that you invest your time and don't have to suddenly leave to go to work without having even been able to make it to the end of the voting queue. That's more than a deterrent to vote. That's actively imperiling voting for a lot of people, because you make it a circumstance that is incongruent with the ability to hold down an employment, to hold down a job. And certain jobs that you have that require weekend shifts, jobs that you're more likely to have if you have been relatively underserved by a system in which an educational system and a housing system that has discriminated against you because of your skin color and discriminated against you because of your demographics' collective tendency to vote for Democratic candidates instead of Republicans. So Black people are punished for voting against Republicans at a collective level, because 93% of Black people voted for Hillary Clinton rather than for Donald Trump in 2016. And it increased to 12% of Black people voting for Trump, 12% of Black voters, I should say, voting for Trump. So what does that make it? 88%. 88% of Black people voted for Joe Biden. Black voters voted for Joe Biden in 2020. And again, will continue to be punished at a legislative level in state legislatures that are controlled by the Republican Party. One book that I really need to get my hands on is Laboratories of Autocracy, written by David Pepper. Is it David Pepper? Just check. Oh, and while I'm looking, what I will do is play for my audience a Daily Show view. So Trevor Noah's team on the Daily Show are very good at making January the 6th be felt by its viewing public. So what they've done is contrasted the rhetoric of Fox News hosts, but they've taken out the footage that was actually playing when they were originally speaking, which was the social justice protests in association with George Floyd's murder, that did sometimes devolve into property destruction and violence by some bad actors, and also by some white supremacist accelerationist bad actors who tried to add extra violence against authorities such as police, and were violent and destroyed property and set fires because they wanted to accelerate the pathway that America in their perception, was taking towards a race war. They wanted power from being the ones to initiate a race war, hence setting fire to things, including police stations. And there have been a variety of white supremacist Boogaloo-affiliated people arrested in conjunction with those protests and riots from around that time. I mostly want to call them protests, but some people rioted, some people destroyed property. So scrolling down to that Daily Show thing again, I'm gonna play it for everybody. Here we go.
This kind of mob-like behavior has got to stop before somebody gets hurt. Violence, intimidation, unacceptable in this country.
It's not a protest. These aren't children. These are adults, and they're destroying our country.
I think what is so jarring to so many Americans right now is just the fact that there's so much lawlessness. Why isn't anybody stopping the looting and the vandalism and the destruction of private and public property?
That giant lie handicapped the police, so they couldn't do a damn thing to stop the riots without being accused of attacking mostly peaceful protesters. These include people who threw projectiles at cops,
screaming the most disgusting things in their faces, an inch away from their face.
Fuck you, police!
Someone with long hair with a flag hitting someone else. You know, all of this violence.
How is rioting, throwing things at police officers, how does this solve anything?
It isn't just an attack on police. Think about it. It's an attack on the rule of law, on civilization itself.
I don't understand the rioting, the looting. I understand peaceful protests, and I think most people do. But when it comes to all this violence, people throwing things at each other, enough is enough.
Well, they're willing to create violence and riots just to win an election.
And they're not taking this White House. We're going to fight like hell, I'll tell you right now.
That's pretty scary.
In other countries, many, when folks disagree with an election, they riot. We don't do that, or at least most of us don't.
Yeah, I wonder when Senator John Kennedy made that comment. So good to see that has 782,000 views, because people should know it's convenient to Republicans to try to downplay and minimize the events of January the 6th. I'm very glad that Merrick Garland not only was public with the commitment of the Department of Justice to investigating people at any level who not only were present on that day, attacking police officers, injuring police officers, and seeking to hang and take hostage, murder, imprison America's legislators to prevent them from certifying Joe Biden's election victory. But also the people behind the scenes who were planning to benefit from that impotence to the congressional proceedings, the planned congressional proceedings of that day. And the people we need to be grateful to for that event still occurring are the congressional staffers, the aides, probably paid a very low salary, who picked up the box of electoral college votes and evacuated them, as well as evacuating themselves. What people don't realize, if that day had succeeded, if the obstruction had continued and Nancy Pelosi hadn't reconvened Congress to finish counting the electoral college votes, to finish with the formalities of just ticking the box for Joe Biden's victory, their intention was to say, look, Mike Pence, see all this pressure, see the will of the people that wants Donald Trump to stay in power. What we need you to do now is say, well, look, this election is just so contentious, I'm just going to throw it back to the states. All the secretaries of state have certified the election results in their states, but I'm just going to say, look, there's so much objecting from elected people like Senators Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley. They've objected to the electoral vote counts from their states and other states. Let's throw it back to the states. Trump's going to keep calling those secretaries of state and saying, I just need you to find me 11,780 more votes so that I win. Because, of course, I did win. I won. It's criminal for you to ignore the reality of me having won the election. And another thing that would happen then is the election would be so contested. There's a provision in the Constitution that says you can throw it to the House of Representatives, and then each state gets a representative. So it doesn't become anymore who's got the majority in the House of Representatives, because Democrats hold a majority of seats in the House of Representatives. But the congressional provision for a contested the constitutional provision for a contested election is one representative per state can then vote who should be the president. The election is a stalemate because it's so contested. And guess which political party has a higher count, strictly in terms of total of states that are represented by more Republicans and Democrats? It is the Republican Party. And their plan was to so disrupt the certification of the election that this constitutional provision, they would then say, we have to activate this. It has to be thrown to the House of Representatives to a provision whereby one party member from each state then votes on who gets to be president. And in that case, Republicans would have outnumbered Democrats because the strict number of states who are controlled by Republicans is higher than the number of states controlled by Democrats, even though population tallies mean there are more Democrat representatives that control the House majority. But overall, just in terms of strict counting, tallying up the number of states controlled by one political party versus another, Republicans would have had the upper hand, and Donald Trump would have been returned to office in strict contradiction to the will of the people. And there wouldn't have been shit all that anyone could have done about it. Complaining, yes, trying to take it to the Supreme Court, but it is a constitutional mechanism that relies on the good faith operation of many actors in the system. So Mike Pence was the bulwark against the procedural arm of Donald Trump and his co-conspirators' attempted coup on the United States. And that's something that very few people know. Very few people understand how that particular mechanism of a contested election would work via the United States' own constitution. So thanks for listening, and I hope that explanation has been of value. I can play a clip of Peter Navarro, Trump's former trade advisor, trying to explain his role in one of a few key organizers. But this has also had 1 million views.
We're joined now by the Vice
Liz Cheney, at least explaining a little part of what I've said, I think, and explaining that the former president's daughter went in personally 2 times. They know this from eyewitness testimony, to the private dining room just off to the side of the Oval Office, where Trump was, like the rest of America, glued to his television watching the events of January the 6th, but unlike the rest of America, charged with a sacred duty to act and to defend the people who were under attack by his own supporters.
We're joined now.
That did not work. Because Twitter keeps updating, I guess.
Liz Cheney. We're joined now by the Vice Chair of the Committee, Congresswoman Liz Cheney. Congresswoman Cheney, thank you for joining us again this morning. Happy New Year to you. Now, you were alarmed by this from the very start, from the first moments on January 6th when this started to unfold. You've cut a lonely path in your party. Have you been surprised by anything you found over the last year?
Well, I've certainly been surprised by many things. I think that in the piece that you played by John Carl just a few moments ago, he touched on the fact that we know now, we are learning much more about what former President Trump was doing while the violent assault was underway. The committee has firsthand testimony now that he was sitting in the dining room next to the Oval Office watching the attack on television as the assault on the Capitol occurred. We know, as you know well, that the briefing room at the White House is just a mere few steps from the Oval Office. The president could have at any moment walked those very few steps into the briefing room, gone on live television, and told his supporters who were assaulting the Capitol to stop. He could have told them to stand down. He could have told them to go home. And he failed to do so. It's hard to imagine a more significant and more serious dereliction of duty than that.
So that's great framing because it was a dereliction of duty on his part. He had the power to not only command the National Guard to be activated, to ask the army to send in reinforcements to the police officers, the Capitol police officers and the Metropolitan DC officers who were under extreme and violent attack all during that day. And reinforcements didn't turn up till later on in the afternoon because they had to overcome and sidestep Trump's obstruction by negligence, that he failed to send in reinforcements for those police officers, but also that he was in a unique position of being the idol of those attackers. They didn't like Pence anymore. They weren't saying, yay, we want Trump Pence to stay in the White House. They were literally chanting, hang Mike Pence, and we want Trump. So he was uniquely positioned to command his supporters, his own supporters, to vacate the premises, to cease their attacks on the Capitol, to stop searching for legislators with zip ties and weapons, because they had various weapons, not just flagpoles that they used to beat police officers, and fire hydrants, fire extinguishers that they threw at officers. They also had brass knuckles, baseball bats, hockey sticks, and some had literal guns because they were police officers not on duty, or army veterans, or active duty army personnel. People from all types of service professional backgrounds were there at the Capitol on that day, and definitely evidence has been uncovered that some of them were armed. There was a lot of just run-of-the-mill people, almost not tourists, revolutionary tourists who had been convinced that their presence was, and their loyalty to Trump commanded their presence at the Capitol on that day. So they weren't necessarily armed. Many of them did believe they were participating in a revolution just through force of their presence. But there were other people who had more plans to turn up with weapons and a specific plan of attack. So we are going to be hearing publicly more about what evidence there is with regards to the January the 6th hearings. And the Oath Keepers, 2 Oath Keepers, have tried to sue the January 6th committee for requesting their phone records from their phone service providers, showing that they're keen to be able to hide the degree of pre-planning and forethought and coordination with others that is a part of this story of what they did and what the others did and what the others were hoping would be the outcome of that violent, anti-democratic insurrection on January the 6th. So I see Christopher's comment that it was a great explanation about what Trump was hoping from his procedural coup. Thank you, Christopher. The reinforcement is valuable to me. That was Liz Cheney. This is a denunciation of the modern Republican Party by Reagan's former Solicitor General, whose name is Charles Fried. So this is 2 minutes and 30 seconds. We'll have a quick listen to that.
Well, the thing that frightens me is that it is tied into what is happening politically. Believe it or not, it's related to gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is something which the Supreme Court has said, that's okay. We can't do anything about that. That is why you have state legislatures doing things which a majority of their voters don't want done, but a minority is gerrymandered into power, and the Supreme Court should have put an end to it. And it didn't. And it didn't because those legislators are all Republicans. They would be voted out. They would not be in control of state after state after state because they've got unfair voting systems. And the Supreme Court says, not our department. Well, if it isn't their department to protect democracy, I don't know what is. And if democracy were protected, first of all, you wouldn't have the justices you have on the court now, because that was a sham, what Mitch McConnell did to Merrick Garland, and you wouldn't have the legislatures that you have, and I think you wouldn't have the danger of a reappearance of Donald Trump.
Wow. Well,
you say I have a long perspective.
Yeah.
I do have a long perspective because I was born in Prague in 1935. Czechoslovakia was a real democracy, and the demons of hell came out and spoiled that for 50 years. Now, I see those people re-emerging. I hear the same tunes, and it scares me.
Wow. So he was born in 1935 in Prague, Yugoslavia, and they had a flourishing democracy, and that democracy was ruined by the same death cult type of people who were energized by scapegoating and demonizing minority demographics, Jews, communists. In opposition to communism, look, I am opposed to communism. I don't think it's useful. I think it often leads to mass murder, and mass murder via negligence or active mass murder via imprisoning people. But opposition to communism taken together with scapegoating Jewish people and scapegoating opponents of fascism led to this frenzy of enthusiasm, this uniting gullible people around charismatic leaders like Adolf Hitler and Mussolini. Excuse me for 1 second. Hello? No. Okay. Bye now. Wrong number. That could be diverting. But in any case, Charles Fried, so now a Harvard University law professor, but previously Solicitor General to Ronald Reagan, brought that personal experience from living through fascism and what it did to Europe and indeed the rest of the world that had to get involved in order ultimately to defend themselves against the encroaching tide of empowered racism and empowered anti-Semitism and empowered racial hierarchies of superiority that overexcited people to make them want to take over the world, to join the German army, to be Nazis and commit blitzkrieg, which was lightning strike, military incursions against other countries, and to acquire territory after territory, murder all the Jews or send away all the Jews in each country to be murdered in death camps, and just generally inflict violence and atrocities on the world. And I used to bring that up more often when I felt that sense of urgency to inspire Americans to vote out Donald Trump. That sense of urgency diminished because he's out of office, but the danger hasn't entirely disappeared in that it's been transmuted now into an effort to infiltrate more local positions, school boards, local election officials, electoral vote counters, etc., in order to create more loyal foot soldiers for fascism, people who are delusionally convinced of the need to stay loyal to Trump and to what Trump represents, which is that hierarchical worldview that promises the world to white people. Previously, to Aryan people, you get to occupy the highest rung in a society that Nazis have taken over, and everybody else is subordinate to the needs of Nazis. And now white America's fear of losing status, or white Christian supremacist America, that's upset because sure, not all white people are on board with a supremacist agenda, but at the same time, a majority of white people have not voted for a Democratic presidential candidate since Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1963. So it's been that many decades since a majority of white people ticked a form to say, yes, the Democratic candidate has my vote. Only a minority, a differently layered minority of white people have voted at different times for a Democratic candidate, but the Republican Party has been the home to white people who fear a loss of status or privilege associated with the gains of the civil rights movement that seeks for all of America to benefit when democracy isn't delivered out differentially. Oh, I have to go shortly, but there is one more video that I wanted to play. And that was a little bit of what Peter Navarro admitted to openly last night. Here we go. So the Lincoln Project managed to put some footage together of Ari Melba from MSNBC interviewing Trump's former trade advisor, Peter Navarro, who not only was a trade advisor, but was an advocate for just letting coronavirus rip through the American population. And now is outing himself as having been a principal conspirator for overturning the results of Biden's election victory.
Peter Navarro served as a senior Trump administration official, including as assistant to the president.
All right, great to be with you. I guess I am the trade guy, but tonight I think I'm the January 6th guy.
So go ahead and tell us in your own words, what was the plan itself and who was in on it?
Exactly, and I'm going to tell you that. The plan was simply this. We had over 100 congressmen and senators on Capitol Hill ready to implement the sweep. The sweep was simply that. We were going to challenge the results of the election in the 6 battleground states, that most or all of those states would decertify the election. That would throw the election to the House of Representatives.
You just described you just described this plan as a way to take an election where the outcome was established by independent secretaries of state, by the voters of those states, and legal remedies have been exhausted with the Supreme Court never even taking, let alone siding with, any of the claims that you just referred to. So legally, they went nowhere. Then you will use the incumbent losing party's power, that was the Republican Party that was losing power, to overtake and reverse that outcome. Do you realize you are describing a coup?
No.
All right, so good ad, good for people to hear that. So I was describing that mechanism earlier, whereby in a contested election, there is a provisional mechanism in the Constitution to say, if things are genuinely contentious, everybody agrees that there's just some problem that can't be resolved through the normal mechanisms, throw the election results up in the air and say, let the House of Representatives decide, one vote per state. One vote per state. And then it becomes a contest of the number of states controlled by Republicans versus the number of states controlled by Democrats. And in a strict tally purely of number of states, not at all with any adjustments for population size or numbers of voters, then Republicans win and Donald Trump would have been returned to office. I'll have to find whereabouts it describes this mechanism in the Constitution because I haven't seen it yet myself. In fact, maybe we can Google it right now. It's good for people to know. Provision in the Constitution for throwing election results to the House of Representatives. Loading a page from a document that says Presidential Election Brochure. The National Archives and Records administration. Okay, NARA. Proud to acknowledge its role in the presidential election process. Yes, yes, yes. Vacancies in the Electoral College. Da, 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 da. This is going to be difficult to find, and I might have to look it up another time. Okay, the transfer of certificates to Congress has to occur on or before January the 3rd. On January the 6th, Congress meets in joint session. To count the electoral votes, the President of the Senate is the presiding officer. If a senator and a House member jointly submit an objection, each House would retire to its chamber to consider it. Well, we know that there were a lot of people who objected on the day. There were going to be more people, but some people withdrew their intentions. Or sorry, some people gave away their intentions to object once they were shaken by the events of January the 6th insurrection. But Ted Cruz still objected. Senator Josh Hawley still objected. The president and vice president must achieve a majority of electoral votes. It's 270 to be elected. In the absence of a majority, the House selects the president and the Senate selects the vice president. If a state submits conflicting electoral votes to Congress, the two houses acting concurrently may accept or reject them. So we know Donald Trump was hoping that some states would send an alternate raft of electors to Congress that hadn't been selected, that weren't born of the actual voting outcomes, but were born of Donald Trump's insistence and lies that he had won the election, and he knew that for sure in his heart. But yes, so in the absence of a minority, the House selects the president and the Senate selects the vice president. Well, both houses doesn't describe that mechanism for the House selecting the Senate, but I've heard before it described as one vote per state. And that's how Donald Trump would have won through a provision of the Constitution. And it would have sounded legal, but it just would not have been legal because it wasn't truly a contested election. Donald Trump merely lied about the outcome of the election and said that it was stolen and said that there was voting fraud, but he had... Okay.